Tonight we'll travel through the shadows of ancient history, back to a time when the Sith were not just whispers in the dark, but rulers of empires. This is the forgotten story of Naga Sadow, a Sith Lord whose ambition reshaped the galaxy long before the Jedi ever feared the name Palpatine. It's a long and quiet story, with echoes of war, betrayal, and broken destinies. So wherever you're listening from tonight, settle in, get comfortable, and let the stars guide us. Before we begin, over 85% of people who listen to these stories haven't subscribed yet. If you enjoy these calm lore journeys, subscribing genuinely helps us bring more of them to you. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? Let's begin the story of Naga Sadow, a name lost to time, yet still echoing through the Force. Before the Republic raised its banners, before the Jedi walked the halls of Coruscant, before the Sith were whispers in dark corners, hiding in pairs and shadows, there was something older, something wider, a galaxy still stretching into shape, where power was not yet hidden, where the Force moved like a wind through open plains, raw, untamed, and deeply felt. In this early time, the stars themselves seemed younger. Whole systems pulsed with unfamiliar rhythms. Some planets were quiet and lush, untouched by any traveler. Others burned with war, ruled by monarchs and mystics who believed they alone were chosen. Trade routes were uncarved, languages were scattered, and belief in the Force, though not yet unified, was strong in many places. But it was not always called the Force. It had different names, different rituals. Some saw it as a gift, others a curse, but most feared it. Among these scattered systems was a cluster far from the core worlds, deep in the galaxy's outer rim. Here a red star lit a world of red sands and deep valleys, Korriban. It was a harsh place, filled with winds that howled across canyons and stones that remembered every scream ever shouted into them. This was the cradle of the ancient Sith species, long before they were joined with any outsiders. They were not hidden then. They were not two. They were many. A proud, red-skinned people, strong in the dark currents of the Force. Their power came not from silence, but from expression, passion, fury, love, pain. These were not suppressed, but celebrated. They believed the Force answered only to those who felt completely. To feel was to command was to survive. It was into this culture that something shifted. Strangers arrived, dark-robed, pale-skinned, carrying knowledge and hunger. Exiles from a distant war, Jedi who had turned away from the light, banished from the Republic for practicing forbidden teachings. These exiles, later called the Dark Jedi, did not come to conquer, not at first. They came seeking refuge, but in the Sith, they saw something familiar. In the Dark Jedi, the Sith saw something new. The union was not quick, it was not gentle, but over time, the two threads twisted together, and from their bond, a new order was born. Not just Sith as a species, Sith as a belief, a code, a power. Naga Sadow was not alive then, not yet, but the galaxy he would inherit was shaped by this collision, this spark between exile and empire. He was born into a world that remembered the Dark Jedi not as enemies but as ancestors. Their knowledge had been kept, expanded, worshipped, and over generations, the Sith evolved. Their temples grew larger, their rituals grew darker, their hunger reached further. The Sith Empire that rose was not one of secrecy but of pride. They wore their darkness openly. They ruled systems with visible force, their architecture cut into the skies. Their voices echoed in the minds of those who served. The Massassi, A race bred for strength became their warriors. The Kisai, the priest caste, preserved their knowledge, all beneath the ruling class of Sith Lords. And at the top always sat someone who believed the future belonged to them. The Republic had heard whispers. Traders spoke of strange powers beyond the rim. Explorers went missing, but the Republic was busy with its own matters. It saw the outer rim as distant, primitive. The Jedi focused inward, guarding peace among the core. They did not look outward, not yet. And so the Sith grew unchallenged. But this power was not still. Among the Lords of the Sith, ambition ran like blood. Betrayals were common. Empires were built and broken within decades. Power passed from one hand to the next, sometimes through war, sometimes through visions. And over time, the Sith began to turn on each other more than on any outside threat. It was into this era, a time of glory and rot, that Naga Sadow was born. He was born into a lineage that had already forgotten peace. From the moment his eyes opened, power had already divided the stars. Naga Sadow's earliest memories were of temples carved from stone and obsidian, where the air hummed with old voices. Every corner of his world whispered something. Secrets were not hidden, they were taught. His tutors spoke not of balance, but of victory, not of self-control, but of will. The Force, they said, did not guide, it obeyed. He listened closely. Sadow was not the strongest of his peers. Not at first. There were others with louder voices, faster blades, deeper scars, but he had something else. He watched, he remembered, he waited. While others sought fame through duel and dominance, Sadow slipped between chambers, read forbidden texts, traced old symbols. He was drawn not just to power, but to its patterns. Why did some Sith fall while others rose? What made ambition succeed in one era and collapse in another? He believed the answer lay in history and in secrets buried too long. At the heart of the Sith Empire was the dark side, but around it stood layers of ritual and order. Not all Sith welcomed this. There were factions. One side wanted to preserve the old ways, the traditional balance of caste, bloodline, and slow accumulation. They feared disruption. They feared the fire that Sadow represented, because even in his youth, he had already begun to whisper ideas that unsettled the halls of power. He spoke of expansion, of pushing past the borders, of war not just as reaction, but as vision. His words were dangerous, not because they were loud, but because they made others listen. The Sith had grown used to isolation. They ruled strong, but they ruled from within. Their empire had borders, and those borders held. Sadow questioned why. Why stop? Why hide? Why wait for the Republic to find them? Why not strike while their enemies were still blind? Some called him reckless, others brilliant, but none ignored him. By the time he reached the age of command, Sadow had already gathered followers. Not many, but enough. Some were younger Sith, drawn to the fire in his voice. Others were scholars, tired of the slow rot of the council. Even a few among the priest caste began to murmur his name in quiet spaces, wondering if he might bring renewal or ruin. But power in Sith culture was not given. It was taken, and Sadow knew that too. He waited for the right fracture, the right opening in the foundation, and when it came from the stars. A ship crashed on Korriban. Republic markings. 2 explorers, lost, captured by Massassi scouts. Most on the council wanted to execute them quickly, wipe the risk, erase the mistake. But Sadow saw something else. An opportunity, proof that the Republic still didn't know the Sith were alive. Proof that the galaxy was still blind. He argued for patience, for deception, for strategy. He was denied, and so he moved in secret. The Sith Council was divided, but still held its own rituals of control. Sadow defied them, freed the prisoners, framed a rival, planted false evidence, staged an attack on his own citadel, everything perfectly placed to create chaos. Within days, blood spilled in the council chambers, accusations, executions, and when the dust settled, it was Sadow who stood tallest, cloaked in victory, whispering peace. But peace was never his goal. He used the moment not to quiet the empire, but to ignite it. With new authority and false justification, he began building fleets, armies, forging alliances with forgotten warlords in the Outer Rim, stirring the ancient rites of battle that had slept too long. All while the Republic still believed it had no enemies. Could it be that Sadow never wanted to rule the Sith, only to aim them? The stars above Korriban began to change. Fleets were no longer symbols, they were instruments. Temples once used for study echoed now with the rhythm of war drums, and beneath it all Naga Sadow stood still, eyes always looking outward, not at what was, but at what could be. He did not move like a conqueror. He moved like a man who had already seen the ending, and was only walking the path toward it. His plans were not loud, but they were wide. Whole worlds were drawn into his influence through promises, through fear, through prophecy. Old holocrons, long dismissed as legend, began to resurface. Some said he could read them without activating them. Others whispered that he had written them in a past life. Even within his own growing circle, few knew what he truly wanted. There was one belief, though, that stayed at the center of all he did. Sadow believed the galaxy was not meant to be ruled by hidden hands. He believed in empires that stood in the open, declared themselves, and dared the galaxy to resist. Where others saw the Republic as a sleeping beast, he saw it as a wall, one that needed to be broken before it ever woke. He often walked alone along the cliffs of Ziost, staring into the night sky. Those who watched him said he spoke to no one, but listened as if someone else was always speaking. The wind maybe, or the Force itself. Could it be that he was already haunted by the future he was creating? His most trusted aides noticed the change. Sadow became quieter, but never uncertain. His eyes held something deep, not fear, but burden. The kind that came with knowing you were building something that could never truly last. The Sith Council, now weakened and reshaped by his quiet war, watched carefully. Some still opposed him, though few dared say so aloud. Others pledged loyalty, hoping to survive the storm. But there was one Sith who saw through Sadow's calm, Ludo Kresh. Where Sadow represented ambition, Kresh held fast to tradition. Where Sadow whispered of conquest, Kresh spoke of balance. They were not enemies yet, but something had already begun to crack between them. Sadow pushed forward anyway. He continued to build in secret, even as he led in public. Hidden shipyards, armored legions, dark rituals that fed on old magic. On Yavin 4, he began to dig deep into the jungle, not just to hide weapons, but to awaken something ancient. The Masasi was sent ahead. Structures rose, statues carved in his image. It was no longer just a war he was preparing for. It was a memory he was trying to plant before anything had even begun. What kind of man builds a monument to his future before his war even starts? He told the Sith he was preparing to defend them. He told the stars he was preparing to rule them. The Jedi, still far away in the Republic core, felt something, but did not act. They meditated, uncertain. The Force trembled, but offered no clear sign, and so the galaxy waited. Quiet, balanced for a moment, on a thread of silence. Sadow was patient, but patience for him was not peace. It was a held breath. He believed the galaxy had forgotten what fear felt like, that it had grown too comfortable, too blind. He would remind them, he would tear through the lie of safety and show them the truth that darkness had never died. It had only waited. But even then, with fleets in orbit and temples burning with energy, something still pulled at the edges of his thoughts. Not doubt, but distance, like a voice just out of reach. Some nights he would pause mid-sentence, staring into nothing, and when asked what troubled him, he would only whisper, "Not yet." Could it be that even he feared the very future he was building? The day the Sith fleet launched, the sky above Korriban turned red with reflection. Not fire, not flame, just the dull, steady glow of something inevitable. Naga Sadow stood at the edge of a landing platform, cloaked not in armor, but in silence. Around him, commanders barked orders, Massassi warriors roared into the wind, and ships screamed into the stars. But he said nothing. Because for him, the war had already begun long before the ships ever moved. He didn't crave battle for blood. He didn't smile when the war drums echoed. His ambition had always lived somewhere quieter, deeper. A part of him believed this war was not conquest, but correction, that the galaxy had turned away from something ancient, and he was simply pulling it back. The attack on the Republic would be sudden, fast, not complete, not at first. Sadow didn't want to destroy the Republic immediately. He wanted them to feel uncertain, to doubt, to stumble. He knew fear would last longer than fire, so he crafted illusions, weaponized deception. Whole fleets appeared where none existed. Explosions bloomed across systems that were never truly touched. Worlds surrendered not because they were defeated, but because they believed they already had been. And yet, beneath the brilliance of the strategy, a shadow lingered, a flaw.
Because illusions work best when no one is watching closely.
And not all in the Republic were blind. Among the Jedi, a few began to see through the tricks. Master Oru, Jedi Empress Teta, names long faded but sharp in that moment. They didn't just fight back, they studied, they adapted, and slowly, piece by piece, they began to realize the size of the lie. The strength behind the curtain was not endless. Sadow knew this. He had hoped to overwhelm before they had time to see clearly, but time, like truth, cannot be held for long. Meanwhile, back within the Sith Empire, cracks began to grow. Ludo Kresh had watched from the shadows, just as Sadow once had. He saw the fleet vanish into the void and did not cheer. He saw the temples emptied and did not speak. But inside, something stirred, not just jealousy, but fear. He believed Sadow had broken the natural law of Sith tradition, that in reaching too far, he had weakened the very roots of their strength. And perhaps he was right. Kresh began to gather those still loyal to the old ways, quietly, carefully. Sith who believed war should be earned, not forced, who believed survival came from control, not explosion. He called it preservation. Sadow called it treason. But neither acted immediately. Both sides waited for the Republic to decide the tempo of the next move, and while they waited, the galaxy seemed to hold its breath. What if this silence between storms was the last moment the Sith could have turned back? Sadow, never blind to the risks, moved deeper into ritual. On Yavin, his temples grew. The Massassi dug into the roots of the moon. Dark chambers were carved, filled with relics and voices. Some say Sadow slept in stone crypts between battles, wrapped in force shields so thick that time itself bent around him, that he spoke to no one for days, only emerging when the stars had shifted. He was not just waging war on the Republic. He was preparing for something larger, something older. Some believe he was trying to unlock the secret of eternal rule, not immortality, but echo, a way to stamp his vision into the Force itself so that even if he fell, the galaxy would never forget him. Others say he saw his own end already written and was simply preparing the ground for what would come after. Could it be that Naga Sadow never believed he would survive but acted anyway? Even those closest to him began to question. Whispers passed between temples. Some feared he had seen too far into the dark. Others believed he was touched by prophecy, but none denied that the galaxy was changing, and it was Sadow who had pushed it forward. But forward into what? The stars, once calm, now flickered with uncertainty. Republic forces gathered in secret. The Jedi meditated not on peace, but on defense, and deep beneath the jungles of Yavin, the drums of the Massassi beat slower, as if waiting for something to answer back. The storm did not break with fire. It unraveled with silence. The final stages of Sadow's campaign met resistance sharper than expected. Republic fleets began to organize. Jedi councils sent warriors, not diplomats. And for the first time, Sadow saw cracks in his vision. His illusions were met with clarity. His strategies, once untouchable, were now anticipated. What he had once controlled began to slip through his fingers, not because of weakness, but because time had finally caught up to him. And then betrayal came. Ludo Kresh, who had watched and waited, now moved. With the Republic pressing in from the outside, Kresh struck from within. A civil clash began, not grand, but personal. Two ideologies, two futures, one believing in conquest, the other in caution. Their conflict shattered what little unity the Sith still had. Armies turned against armies. Ships once forged for the same war now faced each other across dark space. Sadow struck back with fury, but also with weariness. The force around him pulsed with warning. Yavin's jungles grew colder. The Massassi whispered of omens. Even the stars seemed dimmer. Perhaps he had reached the edge of what power could give. He returned to Yavin, not in victory, not in defeat, but in exile, self-imposed, perhaps, or fated. And the galaxy turned. The Republic, now aware, expanded its reach. Jedi were sent to cleanse the remnants of Sith influence. Systems once ruled by fear were reclaimed. Sadow's name began to fade from the records, not by accident but by choice. The victors did not want to remember him. His temples were sealed, his holocrons buried or hidden, his rituals unspoken. The Sith would not rise again in numbers, not for a long time. And so the galaxy that Sadow had tried to reshape began to forget. But forgetting is not the same as erasing. Beneath the vines of Yavin 4, deep inside the temples carved with care and fury, his influence lingered. It would speak again. Not now, not soon, but eventually, in whispers, in symbols, in the dreams of those who came searching for something older than memory. Could it be that Naga Sadow had never wanted to win, only to be remembered? The Force moves in echoes, and some echoes travel farther than others. The Sith who followed would rarely speak his name, not out of disrespect, but out of fear. Fear that what he had done could not be undone. That in one war he had burned too many paths. That in reaching too far, he had shown too much. Yet there is something haunting in his silence. What kind of galaxy did Naga Sadow grow up in? It was one where the Sith were many, where power was not hidden but celebrated, where the Force was not balanced but raw, loud, and known. It was a galaxy of empires built on feeling, not control, of rituals that reached toward the stars with open hands, of temples where voices didn't whisper, they sang. Why then was it forgotten? Not because it was small, but because it was too vast, too wild, too dangerous to remain in memory. The Republic could not allow it. The Jedi could not explain it. And so it was buried, like so many things that frighten those who believe they stand in the light. But the story remains, beneath rubble, beneath silence, beneath stars that once knew his name. And if you listen closely, some nights, through the branches of Yavin, you might still hear it. There was a time when the Sith did not march with armies or sit on thrones of flame, when their hands did not wield power over planets, but trembled over symbols carved into stone. Before they were conquerors, they were seekers, keepers of old knowledge, listeners to the dark. Naga Sadow came from this time, though his name would later be tied to war. In his early years, he did not study with generals. He sat with the Kisai, the priest caste, and watched the red suns set through the stone slits of ancient temples. These halls did not echo with shouting. They hummed with a softer power, one that lived in forgotten words and whispered rites. The Force, to the early Sith mystics, was not a tool. It was a rhythm, a current in the blood, something that could not be broken, only redirected. They spoke to it through song, through pain, through silence. They believed it answered those who surrendered fully to their own emotions, not to control them, but to become them. Sadow absorbed this like breath. He was not loud in those years. He walked the paths others ignored. He spent days in silence, staring at holocrons too damaged to speak. He memorized broken patterns in the stone. He asked questions most others had stopped asking, not to challenge, but to understand. There was one ritual, old and rarely spoken aloud, that he returned to often. It told of the dark side as a living thing, not just energy, not just a presence, but a will, a voice that chose who to guide and who to consume. It was not taught openly. Even the Kisai were careful around it. But Sadow lingered in its shadow. He believed there was truth buried in that fear. One night, under a double eclipse, he entered a forgotten chamber beneath the Valley of Golg. No records mention who opened the path for him. No guards were seen, but those who watched from the cliffs claimed the wind changed when he went below, that it stopped moving, just for a moment. He emerged at dawn, eyes bloodshot, skin marked with ash, and though he spoke no word of what he had seen, something in him had shifted. His steps were slower, his voice lower. He began wearing the amulets of the old sorcerers, the ones even Sith Lords had stopped claiming. From then on, Sadow's study turned sharper. He did not just observe rituals, he altered them, reconstructed them, not to weaken them but to complete them. He believed the ancient sorcery had been broken by fear, that the Sith had silenced parts of their own past in the name of order, and that if those pieces were restored, they could do more than rule. They could reshape reality itself. His theories unsettled many, not because they were wrong, but because they made sense. The Sith had grown strong, yes, but their power remained trapped in cycles of politics and bloodlines. Sadow's path offered something different, something deeper. Could it be that the other Sith feared not his ambition, but his clarity? He wrote nothing down. Everything lived in memory, in symbols marked in temporary sand, in words whispered in dialects so old they sounded like static. His followers called him a visionary. His rivals called him unstable, but both agreed he had become something else. In the quiet corners of the temples where light did not reach, Sadow's rituals began to grow stranger. He spoke to things others could not hear. He performed rites without witnesses, claiming that presence would alter the Force's response. When questioned, he would only say some knowledge isn't meant to be seen, only survived. The Massassi who served him began to change as well, not just in loyalty but in shape. Their bodies grew heavier, their minds quieter. Some claimed they were being blessed by the rituals. Others whispered of alchemy, the reshaping of life by will alone. Sadow denied nothing, but he offered no explanations either. His chambers were filled with artifacts, bones of beasts long extinct, crystals that pulsed without light, scrolls sealed in languages even the oldest Kisai refused to touch. He surrounded himself not with advisors, but with echoes, voices in the dark, presences that stayed after the flame was gone. It wasn't that he rejected the Force as others knew it. He simply believed it was incomplete, that the Force had layers, veils of energy, each requiring different eyes to see. He once told a fellow Lord that the Jedi saw only one color of the spectrum, and that the Sith, in their pride, had limited themselves to only two. But beneath those, Sadow believed, were shades neither side had dared to explore. He experimented not for pleasure but for revelation. He opened doors because he believed they were meant to be opened. Not all led to power. Some led to pain, and some to nothing at all. But he kept going, because for him the only failure was silence. Among the other Sith Lords, the whispers began to shift. At first they had dismissed him as a mystic, a scholar chasing phantoms. But when he began shaping his teachings into action, they grew cautious. His followers increased, his temples deepened. His name began to carry weight not just in history, but in fear. They called him a sorcerer, not as a title, but as a warning. But Sadow did not fight the label. He embraced it. In his eyes, sorcerer simply meant one who sought truth beyond accepted rules, one who broke the shape of the Force to see what lay beneath. He claimed that the greatest lie in the galaxy was that the Force had limits, that its will was balanced. Sadow believed the Force was not balanced at all, but restless, constantly shifting, and that only those who dared to fall into it fully could understand what it wanted. He began constructing new rites, not for show but for testing. He carved runes into cave walls using only thought. He bent gravity inside sealed rooms. He placed Massassi warriors into sleep for weeks, then woke them with single syllables. Each act meant something. Each one was a step toward an understanding too large for most to carry. Could it be that he was preparing not to rule, but to transcend? The other lords, seeing his power grow without armies or wars, began to see him not just as dangerous, but as separate, different. The kind of different that could not be controlled. Some believed he was trying to become a god. Others feared he already had. But Sadow never claimed divinity. He claimed memory. He wanted to restore what had been lost, not the Republic's records or Jedi teachings, but the true Sith language. The one that lived in pain, in instinct, in ritual. He said the dark side did not speak in words. It spoke in hunger, and he was listening. Even the oldest among the Kisai grew uneasy. Sadow was not the first to chase these shadows. Others had tried, many had disappeared, but he was the first to return, changed. What had he seen that the rest of them could not? The jungles of Yavin began to draw his attention, not for war, not for hiding, but for listening. He believed the planet spoke, not through voice, but through resistance, that its roots, its vines, its silence carried messages from something ancient, He called it a place of remembering, a world that had held the Force before any species had shaped it with language. Sadow built temples there, not to rule from, but to feel through. Each structure was aligned with forgotten constellations, each chamber carved with runes older than Korriban itself. He said they were not designs. They were maps, not of places but of states of being. Each temple was a doorway, and not all doors were meant to be walked through. He walked through them anyway. In one chamber he vanished for 9 days. No one entered. No one guarded the entrance. When he emerged, the Massassi nearby bowed without being told. They said his presence had changed, that his eyes no longer blinked the same way, that his voice, once steady, now carried weight that echoed twice. He never explained what had happened inside, only that it was necessary. From that point, his sorcery deepened. The rituals became quieter, but more exact. He no longer used spoken words to shape energy. He used memory, his own, the scars on his hands, the taste of old wounds, the names of lost friends. He said emotion was the only language the Force truly understood, and the darker the feeling, the clearer the message. Sith magic for Sadow was never about control. It was about clarity, peeling back the layers of thought, of structure, of fear, until only the raw will remained. That was the source. Not books, not crystals, but the heart, the moment it breaks, and what you choose to do with the pieces. Some said he had gone too far, that he had stopped being Sith and become something else, but others followed more closely. They sat outside his temples, waiting for hours, sometimes days, to hear a single word from him. Those words often came like riddles. The flesh remembers, he once said, placing his hand on the stone wall of a half-finished shrine, even when the mind lies. One of his followers asked him if he feared death. Sadow paused. "No," he said softly, "but I fear forgetting." That answer would follow him for years. It explained why he recorded nothing, why he carved nothing permanent in his own image. He believed truth was always changing, that only living memory could keep it from hardening into falsehood. So he passed his teachings through presence, through tone, through energy shared in silence. Could it be that he didn't want disciples, only witnesses? His rivals grew restless. They wanted titles, borders, fleets, and here was Sadow, alone in the jungle, drawing power from soil and shadow. They could not understand how such silence held more power than armies. But it did. When Sadow returned to the Sith Council, he brought no legions, no declarations, only silence. And yet the room shifted. Even those who hated him quieted. His presence was not loud, but it left no space. He did not demand power. He simply stood where power could not be ignored. That was the strength his sorcery had given him. Not destruction, but density. He carried the weight of every ritual, every vision, every moment spent listening to what others had refused to hear. Was it wisdom, or madness shaped into form? Not all who watched him feared what he could do. Some feared what he might become. Among the Sith, stories had long whispered of those who vanished into the dark, chasing truths too wide to hold. Some returned broken, others never returned at all. But Sadow had walked deeper than most and come back stronger, not in body, not even in mind, but in something that lived behind his eyes. He didn't argue, he didn't shout, but when he spoke, the room leaned toward him, and when he was silent, the silence pressed harder than any words could. The old Sith called that kind of presence An Sharak, the weight of knowing, and Sadow carried it now. His rituals were no longer just private acts. They began to shape his decisions. He read battles before they happened. He sensed betrayals before words were spoken. He once stood beside a Massassi warrior and said, without looking, "You miss your brother." The warrior had not spoken of it to anyone, not even to himself, but Sadow had felt the ache beneath the skin. Some believed he had passed the limits of sight, that he now walked through time in his own way, not bound to the present like others. He never confirmed it, but he never denied it either. When asked, he would only say, "The Force doesn't move in lines, only in rhythms. You just have to hear it." He still studied ancient texts, still uncovered lost temples, but his methods became more abstract. He began collecting not objects but memories from dying Sith, from wounded Massassi. He believed that trauma imprinted truth, that in the final moments of pain, a person dropped all falsehood, and that truth could be passed through presence if one knew how to listen. He sat with the dying often not to comfort, not to save, but to witness, to learn. Could it be that he believed death was the only honest teacher? The Sith Council by then had already split behind closed doors. Some supported him openly, others whispered of exile, but no one dared move against him directly, because even those who opposed him feared that if they struck, he would know it before they raised their hand. They called him heretic, prophet, madman, visionary, but none of those names held weight. He responded to none. In truth, he had already begun to move beyond names. What he sought now was not victory, not even rule. He sought something deeper, a fracture in the Force itself, a place where all things touched, life, death, memory, desire. He called it the root. He believed that beneath the wars, beneath the rituals and the Jedi and the Sith, there was one place the Force began. And if one could reach it, not through ships or weapons, but through surrender, then one could understand everything, and perhaps rewrite it. He didn't seek the root with hope. He sought it with burden, as if drawn by something he had no choice but to follow. His skin had begun to change, not visibly, but energetically. Those near him described feeling heavier, slower, as if time stretched when he was near. Animals avoided his path. The air shifted behind him. He wasn't becoming a god. He was becoming a memory. And maybe that's what he had always wanted. There are no records of Sadow's final ritual before the war, no witnesses, no artifacts, only silence and a faint burn mark on the stone floor of his northern temple. The Massassi refused to enter that chamber again, not out of fear, they said, but respect. Whatever had happened there was not for the living to understand. Some say he opened a gate that never closed. Others believe he reached the root he had always spoken of, and some believe he saw the end, not just of the Sith, but of everything, that in the stillness, beyond the layers of the Force, he saw a galaxy stripped of Jedi, Sith, and war, a galaxy where even memory faded, and that it terrified him. He emerged pale, slower than before, but not weaker. His voice held even more gravity. He walked without sound, and when he looked at others, it was not like looking through them. It was like remembering them, even those he'd never met, as if somehow he already knew how their story would end. From that day on, his decisions sharpened. He abandoned old alliances, cut ties without explanation, moved his operations entirely to Yavin, left entire legions behind without a second glance. He stopped attending council meetings, stopped speaking to those who had once called him brother, because he no longer needed their permission. He believed the Sith were reaching their ceiling, that their hunger had led them in circles, that their rituals, once alive, had become performance. He told one of his last followers, in a whisper not meant to be recorded, "We Sith stopped listening, and the dark hates to be ignored." But Sadow had not stopped listening. He still heard it, in the wind, in the stone, in the silence between thoughts. And it told him something no Sith wanted to hear. That conquest would destroy them. Not because they would lose, but because they would forget. That in reaching outward, they would lose what had once been inside, the fear, the wonder, the surrender to something deeper than power. But Sadow knew he couldn't stop the war. It was already moving, already breathing, and maybe he had helped start it. Maybe every ritual, every door opened had pulled something loose that now couldn't be pushed back. Could it be that he used sorcery not to win, but to soften the fall? He began sealing his temples, not with locks, with time. He layered force energy across walls like dust. He spoke final words into chambers and closed them behind him, not to return. He placed Masasi in stasis, heed relics, not for himself, but for those who would come long after. Not to wield his power, but to remember that someone had once listened. The other Sith thought he was retreating, but Sadow wasn't fleeing. He was preserving. The galaxy would burn. He knew that now, and the dark would change. It would become sharper, narrower, twisted into tools. The mystics would fade. The seekers would go silent. The force would be cut in half. Light and dark, split by war, worshipped in fragments. And maybe that was always meant to happen. But Sadow would not be part of that version. His path was older, quieter. And when he was gone, he left no grave, only questions. Did he vanish into the Force? Did he fall into one of his own rituals and become something we cannot name? Or did he simply sit beneath the roots of Yavin, close his eyes, and let the galaxy forget him? No one knows. But sometimes when the jungle is still, the ground hums. And some say if you press your hand against the stone walls of his temple, you can still feel a heartbeat. There was no thunder in the beginning, no armies moved, no stars fell, just a whisper, soft, careful, and shaped with purpose. The great hyperspace war would be remembered for fire and death, but its first spark lived in silence. And at the center of that silence was Naga Sadow. He had grown quiet in public. Some believed he was retreating into mysticism again, returning to his temples to seek more forgotten power. But that wasn't true. He was waiting, watching. The rituals were no longer about discovery. They were about positioning. He understood something the other Sith Lords refused to see, that empires didn't fall from battle alone. They crumbled from within, when pressure was applied at just the right points. Sadow didn't need more weapons. He needed doubt, fear, and a reason for the Sith to follow him into a war they didn't yet believe in. The opportunity came in the form of a mistake. 2 Republic explorers had crossed the Outer Rim. Unknowingly, they entered Sith space. Their ship was captured. The incident could have been small. The Sith Council debated execution, interrogation, exile, but Sadow saw something else. A thread, a way to pull the Republic into view and to pull the Sith toward war. He argued for patience, for study. He told the Council this was a chance to learn the Republic's weaknesses. He spoke of gathering intelligence, gaining leverage, but his voice, calm and measured, carried something heavier, the shape of a plan he didn't share. They didn't yet agree with him, so he moved alone. The prisoners were taken, hidden. The records of their arrival were altered. and Sadow began to build a lie, a carefully crafted illusion. He staged an attack, a bold one, against a Sith stronghold. He made it appear as if Republic agents had launched an assassination. Explosives, disguises, documents forged in Republic code. The Council was horrified. The Sith had been violated. And in that chaos, Sadow stepped forward with calm. He proposed a response. Not just punishment, expansion, a reason to strike, a reason to unite. He wasn't just starting a war, he was crafting permission. But why? What did he truly want? Some said it was glory, that he saw the Republic as weak, unprepared, and ripe for conquest. Others believed it was legacy, that Sadow, for all his mysticism, wanted to be remembered as the one who brought the Sith into the open. But perhaps there was something deeper. Maybe Sadow wasn't trying to destroy the Republic. Maybe he was trying to prove something to the Sith. Could it be that he believed they had forgotten how to be powerful? The Sith Council had grown slow, careful, obsessed with hierarchy, with rules. Their rituals had become habits, their wars, simulations. Sadow wanted to shake them, to show them that real power didn't come from tradition. It came from risk, from boldness, from stepping into the unknown with open hands. And yet, there was danger, not just from outside, but from within. Ludo Kresh watched everything unfold with silent fury. He saw through the illusion, or at least suspected it, but he lacked proof. He warned the Council. He accused Sadow of deception, but his words came too late. The momentum had shifted, the anger had risen, and the Sith wanted war. Sadow gave it to them. The Council had given him authority, not all of it, but enough. Enough to build, enough to move, enough to turn whispers into action. Sadow wasted no time. He began assembling fleets, drafting soldiers, awakening old outposts that had been silent for years. But this wasn't just military buildup. Every choice, every movement was wrapped in illusion. His forces appeared larger than they were. Through careful manipulation of the Force, Sadow used projection, shadow play, and deep ritual to make one ship look like three, to make empty corridors feel full of marching troops. He wanted the Republic to see a storm coming, even if it hadn't yet formed. And the Republic did see it. Fear spread. Ambassadors were recalled. Trade slowed. Jedi were dispatched to Outer Rim watchpoints. They still didn't fully understand what had happened, but the unease had taken root. Sadow smiled, but only briefly. He knew fear could only carry him so far. Eventually, the war would have to become real, but he still believed that if he could control its story, he could control its outcome. Back on Korriban, tension grew. Ludo Kresh remained, watching with cold suspicion. He saw his fellow Sith being swept into a current they didn't understand. Some followed Sadow out of belief, others out of fear of being left behind. Kresh stood against both. He didn't trust the war, but more than that, he didn't trust the man behind it. He began to gather those still loyal to the old ways, quietly, slowly. Sith Lords who believed tradition mattered, who saw Sadow's tactics as dangerous not just to their empire, but to the very soul of what it meant to be Sith. Could it be that Kresh saw something in Sadow the others refused to admit? Not just ambition, but desperation. Sadow was pushing everything forward with precision, but also with speed. He was sealing paths behind him, closing doors, removing alternatives. It was as if he had seen a future the others couldn't and was racing to meet it before it changed again. And beneath the strategy, something more personal. He began spending more time alone again, locked in quiet meditation, surrounded not by advisors but by silence. Some said he was listening for signs. Others believed he was haunted by doubt. A few even thought he was losing control. But Sadow remained steady, outwardly, his voice calm, his presence firm. And yet, he didn't sleep. He would walk the halls of his starships at night, touching the walls, whispering old Sith phrases that even the Master didn't recognize, as if reminding the metal where it came from, as if reminding himself, could it be that the war was never just against the Republic? What if it was a war to stop himself from forgetting what the Sith had once been? When the First Fleet finally moved toward Republic space, it was not announced with horns or banners. It moved quietly, like a shadow rolling across the stars, and Sadow watched from the bridge of his flagship, hands folded behind his back, as the void ahead began to swallow the past. But he said nothing, because this was only the beginning. The first strikes came like echoes, quick, precise, and wrapped in confusion. Outposts blinked out of contact. Trade lanes collapsed. Worlds along the edge of the Republic faltered before they understood what had happened. And that was the point. Sadow didn't want total conquest. Not yet. He wanted chaos. Enough to stir panic. Enough to make the Republic overreact. His fleets hit targets that made no sense. Agricultural planets, minor relay stations, abandoned mining worlds. Not for their value, but for what they represented. He was writing a message not in words, but in fear. And the Republic received it, hard. Senators called emergency sessions. Jedi Masters left meditation halls. The galaxy, which had drifted in a dream of peace, now awoke with a start, reaching for answers that weren't there. In the midst of this storm, Sadow moved like a ghost. He stayed behind the lines, directing from a distance. He never raised his blade. He never shouted commands. His war was made of silence and precision. He coordinated from Yavin, from the very temples that had taught him how to listen. But something had changed inside him. He no longer walked the stone paths slowly. He moved with urgency, as if every step was pushing away a future he didn't want to see. He met with his commanders less often, spoke shorter, slept even less. His eyes, once filled with the depth of ancient knowledge, now held the weight of something heavier. Because things weren't set going as planned. The Republic wasn't breaking, it was uniting. Worlds that had long ignored Coruscant's call now pledged allegiance. The Jedi, once scattered, now stood together, and more dangerously, they were learning. They began seeing through his illusions, understanding the patterns, cutting off supply lines, rescuing prisoners. The more he pushed, the more resistance grew, and the more resistance grew, the less control he felt. For the first time, cracks began to form in his confidence. Could it be that Sadow never intended to win outright? Was this war a performance, not for the Republic, but for the Sith? Because back on Korriban, the whispers had returned. Ludo Kresh saw the tides turning. He watched the losses build, and he called Sadow's actions reckless, dangerous, even treasonous. He gathered his forces not to challenge the Republic, but to challenge Sadow himself. And this perhaps was what Sadow feared most. Not defeat from without, but collapse from within. He began isolating himself even further. He left the command centers, stopped meeting with the council entirely. The Massassi brought him food he wouldn't eat. Messengers waited hours for single-word replies. Some thought he was planning something. Others thought he was unraveling. But maybe he was doing both. In the jungle depths of Yavin, surrounded by ancient energy, he spent long hours kneeling before a broken statue, one that predated even the Sith, a face no one could name. There he whispered to no one. There he placed a stone in the statue's open hands, and when he left slower than before. What did he ask for? What did he offer? No one knows. But from that moment on, Sadow's presence changed. Not weaker, not stronger, just quieter. He had always walked in shadows, but now it seemed the shadows walked with him. Back on Korriban, Ludo Kresh made his move. He no longer spoke in whispers. He stood before the remaining lords and named Sadow a traitor, not just to the Sith, but to the Force itself. He claimed Sadow had twisted ancient teachings, turned visions into lies, and brought war not for power, but for chaos. Some agreed with him, others hesitated, but all felt the pull. Because the war was beginning to unravel, the Republic's counterattacks had grown sharper. Jedi-led missions had struck key Sith outposts. Whole battalions vanished in ambushes, and through it all, Sadow remained distant. He sent orders through intermediaries. He answered questions with riddles. His silence, once mysterious, now felt like absence. Kresh declared that Sadow had lost his way, that he had become the very threat he warned against, and in that moment the council broke. Lines were drawn, alliances shifted, not around ideals, but around fear. Sadow sensed it before any message arrived. He stood at the edge of one of Yavin's ancient towers, staring into the jungle below, as if the vines could tell him what the stars refused to say. He knew Kresh would not wait long, and he was right. A small fleet appeared in the skies above Yavin. No warning, no negotiations, not Republic, Sith. Kresh had sent ships to end the war, not with the Republic, but with Sadow. The battle was swift and brutal, not between armies, but between visions. Sadow had prepared for it. His defenses activated with precision. His illusions confused and scattered Kresh's forces, but he didn't celebrate. He didn't even watch, because something deeper had broken. He returned to his chambers without a word, sat in the center of the room, closed his eyes, and remembered. He remembered the moment he first walked into the shadow of the Valley of Golg, the cold stone beneath his feet, the feeling that something old had seen him and waited. He remembered the first time he made a crystal hum without touching it, the first time he dreamed of a galaxy with no borders, only energy flowing between willing minds. What had happened to that vision? Was it still there, buried beneath the noise? Could it be that Sadow never meant for any of this to become war? That maybe in trying to awaken the Sith, he had instead broken something they were not ready to hold? He stood alone in a temple carved from dreams, with enemies pressing from two sides, the Republic from without, Kresh from within, and still he whispered no fear. Only this: the Force does not remember victories, only echoes. No one heard him, but maybe the stones did. He walked the temple once more that night, not as a ruler, not as a warrior, as a memory, a shadow moving through the bones of something larger than himself. The next day he ordered a retreat, not a surrender, a withdrawal, not from war, but from the illusion of control. He pulled his fleets back, sealed his deeper temples, his holocrons, buried his rituals, because he knew something the others hadn't yet realized. The war had already been lost, not in space, not in fire, but in trust. The Sith Empire did not collapse overnight, but the crack had formed, and it would never close again. Naga Sadow retreated deeper into Yavin, not out of fear, but purpose. The war had become noise, and he no longer wished to hear it. He instructed the remaining Masasi to prepare the temples for sleep, not for him, for memory, for silence. He knew the Republic would follow. He knew the Jedi would come, but what he had built could not be captured, because it was never built to be seen. He didn't vanish. Not fully. He walked the halls, sat beneath the hanging vines, whispered to the stones, but no more meetings, no more speeches. Those who came looking for guidance found only silence and the distant hum of something that felt like mourning. Could it be that he had always known it would end this way? Maybe the Republic had never been the real enemy. Maybe it had only been a mirror, a reflection held up to the Sith to reveal what they had become. Divided, fractured, loud, but lost. And maybe Sadow had seen that from the beginning. He had used deception not to blind others, but to wake them. He had crafted illusions not to trick, but to test. He wanted the Sith to rise, not in numbers but in clarity, to see that true strength was not in conquest, but in vision, in depth, in the ability to see beyond the surface. But they had chosen differently. They had chosen war, and war had shown them who they really were. Sadow stood at the highest peak of his temple on the final night, eyes lifted toward the stars. He watched as the faint lights of battle flickered across the horizon. Somewhere out there, fleets still moved, Jedi still hunted, the Republic still reacted. But none of it mattered anymore. Not to him. He left no message, no declaration, only stillness. Some say he entered a deep stasis. Others believe he became part of the temple itself, his presence woven into the stone and root. And a few even now believe he still walks the jungle, unseen, whispering reminders to the vines. But the truth, like Sadow himself, refuses to be held. The war ended. The Republic claimed victory. The Sith faded into legend. But echoes remained. And those echoes would one day find voices again, in other names, on other worlds, under different suns. Whispers would rise once more, not just of power, but of vision, of a man who tried to teach through shadows, who believed in a force that moved deeper than control, who tried to pull a broken empire towards something it no longer understood. Was it ambition, or was it hope twisted into shape by time? Perhaps the war was never about territory at all. Perhaps it was a question asked through fire. What does it mean to truly awaken? And perhaps the answer was never meant to come, only to be remembered. The Republic didn't see the sky darken until the shadows were already falling. There were no grand declarations, no warnings carved into stone, only silence, then flame. Naga Sadow's fleets moved not like invaders, but like phantoms. They emerged from nowhere, shaped by illusion and guided by a will that did not waver. Each ship carried more than soldiers. It carried a message, one that had been whispered through temples and stone and blood. The Sith had returned. But this was not conquest in the traditional sense. It was theater. Movement shaped not only for destruction, but for memory. The first systems fell too easily. Outposts vanished. Colonies were isolated. The Republic scrambled, caught between disbelief and urgency. Leaders argued. Jedi were dispatched without full understanding. And above it all, Sadow remained still, deep within his fortress on Yavin, eyes closed, feeling the waves he had released. He was not directing a war in the way others might imagine. He didn't move pieces across a board. He stirred emotions, panic, doubt, awe. That was the war. It wasn't about numbers. It wasn't even about victory. It was about what the Republic would see and what it would never forget. His Masasi legions were not just warriors. They were symbols, their bodies twisted by ritual, armored in black stone, silent as they marched. They fought with a kind of desperation that looked like madness, but was closer to devotion. Each strike they made felt final, not because of its strength, but because of what it represented, a story being carved into the heart of the Republic. Could it be that Sadow didn't want to crush the Republic, but to haunt it? He knew he could not defeat the Jedi forever. He knew the Republic's size, its resources, its alliances. This war, in numbers, made no sense, but numbers were never the point. Sadow was reaching for something deeper. He was building an echo, one that would outlive the bodies, the flames, the ruins. The battles were strange. Ships appeared where none should be. Whole planets believed they were under siege, only to realize the attackers were not real. Fear rippled through the galaxy faster than truth could catch up. Communications failed without cause. Panic erupted in systems untouched by the Sith. And while the Republic scrambled to defend what wasn't being attacked, the real invasion slid in unnoticed, quiet and precise. Jedi Masters began to feel it, the unease, the sense that this war was being fought somewhere just beyond their reach. They reached into the Force and found fog. Visions blurred, prophecies reversed. Some withdrew in confusion, others pushed forward, desperate for clarity that never came. One Jedi, old and unnamed in the records, said something before his final mission that others would repeat in hushed tones for years. We are fighting shadows that already remember us. The Republic began to respond with force. Fleets were pulled from deep space. Jedi were recalled from meditation and sent to lead military efforts. But even then, something felt wrong. The more they fought, the more distant the enemy became. As if every strike landed only on the surface of something deeper, something untouched. Sadow was never where they expected. His main forces appeared, struck, and vanished before they could be pinned. And the places he did not strike still trembled, because the war was being felt more than it was being fought. He used illusions not just to mislead, but to multiply. One ship became a dozen. One attack became a dozen rumors. One Masasi strike force could appear in 3 systems at once. Entire colonies surrendered to threats that weren't even there. But this wasn't carelessness. It was precise, too precise to be random. He wanted the Republic to see monsters in every shadow, to lose trust in their own eyes, their own defenses, their own peace. What if he believed that fear lasted longer than memory? And it wasn't just the Republic that struggled to understand. Even among the Sith, confusion began to grow. Sadow did not share his plans openly. His commanders carried orders they barely understood. Some battles were launched with no warning. Some fleets were told to retreat in the middle of easy victories, and some victories were left unclaimed, as if they were never meant to be held. It made no sense until one looked closer. The planets Sadow did hold were chosen carefully. Religious sites, worlds heavy with history, places where symbols mattered more than strategy, places where the Jedi had once stood tall, or where the Republic had planted flags long ago. He wasn't set just attacking systems. He was attacking stories. Jedi temples burned, not because they held military value, but because their loss would echo. Republic archives were erased, not to hide secrets, but to leave blank pages. He was carving gaps into the timeline, gaps filled with fear. And the Masasi followed him without question. They seemed to understand the war on a level beyond words. Their loyalty was not political, it was spiritual. They believed Sadow was more than a ruler. To them, he was the voice of the Force made clear. They fought like they were already dead, like their lives were small sacrifices for something only they could feel. Could it be that Sadow had promised them something beyond the war? Or had he simply convinced them that the war itself was holy? Among the Jedi, resistance began to harden. They stopped chasing shadows and started fortifying truths. Masters gathered in key systems. Padawans were pulled from distant training and given real assignments. And in some places, the illusions began to falter. Because truth, like fear, spreads when given space. The Jedi began to see patterns in the chaos. They started predicting where Sadow might go next. They understood the emotional logic behind his decisions, not his tactics, but his intent. And with that came danger. Because understanding someone's intent is how you begin to undo them. The deeper the Jedi looked, the more they began to sense something strange at the center of it all. The Force didn't feel like it usually did during conflict. It didn't ripple with anger or rise in defense. It pulsed like a memory, like something already past, now playing again. The Jedi began to wonder, were they fighting a war or walking through someone else's design? On Yavin, Sadow watched from afar. He did not sit in command rooms or argue over maps. He spent his time among stone walls and sleeping beasts, in temples so quiet they seemed outside of time. There he whispered to no one. He lit incense made from extinct roots, and every night he walked alone beneath the stars, touching the runes carved by Massassi hands. He wasn't preparing for victory. He was preparing for remembrance. He had begun to sense it, the end. Not in defeat, but in weight. The war was growing heavier. The illusions were harder to maintain. The Massassi were dying. The Jedi were closing in. But Sadow didn't change course. He ordered more attacks, not to win territory, but to leave marks. He instructed his warriors to burn symbols into the walls of cities, to leave Sith holocrons behind. Broken and visible, he left fragments of his teachings scattered in vaults that he knew the Jedi would eventually open. What if he wasn't trying to conquer the galaxy, but to seed it? Could it be that this war from the beginning had been a ritual of planting, not of power, but of presence? Even his enemies began to feel it. Republic senators stopped talking about strategy and began speaking in tones of dread. Jedi Council members started dreaming of red skies and endless jungles. Some of them had never even seen Yavin, and yet it haunted their minds. Because Sadow wasn't just invading systems, he was invading thought. He understood something the others didn't, that legacy doesn't come from winning. It comes from being impossible to forget. And yet beneath that vision, cracks were forming. His commanders grew tired. The Massassi, once tireless, began to fall faster. They were not meant for sustained warfare. Their bodies, shaped through alchemy and ritual, burned bright, but not long. Some of them died without wounds, simply collapsed in silence, as if they had given everything their bones could carry. Sadow mourned them, quietly. He held no funerals, he burned no pyres, but when they died, he touched their foreheads with his palm and whispered the same phrase each time. You returned to the root. He never explained what it meant. But maybe he believed they had served their purpose, not as soldiers, but as echoes. The Jedi finally found a pattern, not in the movements of fleets, but in the meaning behind them. They began to map not routes, but symbols. Every system struck had a past tied to the Force. Every battlefield was once a sacred site. Every planet held something old, a shrine, a myth, a buried truth. They weren't Sith chasing an enemy. They were following a trail, and it led them to Yavin. By the time they arrived, the war had already begun to fade. Sadow had pulled his forces inward. His outer holdings collapsed without a fight. His temples in distant systems were sealed with strange codes, some made of light, some of language, and some of silence. The Jedi landed on Yavin not with confidence, but caution. The planet breathed around them. The jungle hummed, the stones carried weight, and deep in the heart of it, they found temples older than memory. Walls etched with things they didn't understand, languages that bent the eye to look at, symbols that echoed in the Force like long-forgotten names. And Sadow, he was waiting. Not in defiance, not in surrender, just waiting. He didn't raise a blade. He didn't summon fire. He walked alone to the edge of the temple steps and sat behind him. The Massassi stood still, not in attack, but in reverence. They were not protecting him. They were witnessing him. The Jedi, unsure, approached, but even they could feel it. This was not a battlefield. It was a memory. Could it be that Sadow had known all along that they would come not to fight, but to see? The Jedi did not speak to him. They didn't have to. He had already said everything he needed through the war itself. Every illusion, every ruined archive, every haunting silence. It had all been the message. The real invasion had never been of space. It had been of meaning. And as they stood there, unsure of what to do, the Force shifted around them, not violently, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet sadness. Because the war was ending, not with fire, but with understanding. They did not execute him. They did not imprison him. They simply left, slowly, carefully, as if waking from a dream. And Sadow remained, sitting among his temples, listening to the wind move through stone. What did he gain? What did he lose? Even he may not have known. But the galaxy remembered. The records say the Republic won, that the threat of the Sith was stopped, that peace returned. But peace, like memory, isn't always whole. It bends, it leaves things out. It forgets what it cannot understand. Naga Sadow disappeared from the center of the galaxy. His name was pushed to the side, whispered in back rooms, sealed in restricted archives. The war became a story. The story became a myth, and the myth became something people stopped asking about. But in quiet corners, the truth still stirred. The Massassi left behind on Yavin didn't fade. They changed, they evolved without guidance, holding on to fragments of rituals, gestures, songs with no lyrics. Their temples stayed standing, wrapped in roots and silence. And deep within the largest one, it said that a single chamber remains untouched, that inside it, the air doesn't move, that if you listen long enough, you can still hear footsteps. Sadow never returned to power. He never called for a second war. He had done what he set out to do, not in battle, but in thought. He had made himself unforgettable. Not because he conquered, but because he carved his shape into the Force. The Jedi, for all their wisdom, never fully understood what had happened. Some believed he was a madman, others a mystic. Some thought he had tried to break the galaxy. Others believed he tried to heal it by showing it its own reflection. What if this war was never meant to be won? What if it was meant to leave a scar, a reminder that silence can become a storm, that illusions can reveal more than truth, That a single voice, buried deep in the jungle, can change the path of empires. And maybe that was the lesson all along. Not to fear power, but to fear the stories we forget, the ones that sit just beneath the surface, waiting to be heard again. The Republic moved on. New wars came. New names rose. But the war that shouldn't have happened still whispers. And some nights, if you close your eyes near a world that remembers and listen not with your ears, but with your breath, you might feel it. A chill, a shape in the Force, a man with no throne, no army, no tomb. Just a question left behind in the silence. Do you still remember me? Before it was war, it was tension. And before tension, it was silence. Ludo Kresh stood at the edge of the council chamber on Korriban, long before the First Fleet had ever moved, watching Naga Sadow speak. Others listened, some nodded, a few stayed quiet, unsure whether they admired the fire in Sadow's words or feared it. But Kresh said nothing, not then. He didn't just hate Sadow, that setters what made it worse. They had once walked the same paths, studied under the same masters, sat in the same temples. There had even been a time years ago when Kresh believed Sadow might one day lead, not through violence, but through depth. Sadow had always seen farther than the rest. He asked harder questions. He moved through ritual not as a follower, but as someone listening for something others had missed. But something had changed. The man who once studied alone now spoke in commands. The one who once chased meaning now chased movement. Kresh couldn't say when it shifted, only that it had, and slowly, painfully, the divide between them grew. Sadow saw it too. He began limiting what he shared. He avoided open challenge, but kept Kresh at a distance, not with hostility, but with finality. They would never walk together again. The war had begun, not in space, not in fire, but in that choice. Could it be that both men believed they were saving the Sith? Kresh spoke rarely in public, but when he did, his words struck. He called for caution, for vision. He believed the Sith Empire had grown strong, not through expansion, but through control. He spoke of borders, tradition, survival. He warned that a war with the Republic would not end with victory, but with memory, that the Sith would become something else entirely, loud, exposed, and broken. Sadow brushed it aside. He believed Kresh was bound by fear, that he had grown too used to stillness, too afraid of losing what little power he already held. And maybe in part Sadow was right. Kresh did fear loss, but not of his own standing. He feared the loss of the Sith themselves. He watched Sadow rise with silence in his throat. He watched the fleets launch with his hands still folded. He watched the council fracture while standing still at the center. But watching is not the same as waiting, because deep beneath his stillness, something was growing. Kresh did not move quickly. He gathered his strength like a man lighting a candle in a room full of smoke, slow, deliberate, careful not to let the flame go out too soon. He began with whispers, not orders, quiet conversations with lords who still remembered the older ways. He didn't promise power, he promised preservation. And for some, that was more valuable than glory, because they had begun to see it too, the unraveling beneath Sadow's victories, the shifting weight in the Force, the cracks in what was once sacred. They met in hidden chambers beneath the old tombs. No banners, no declarations, only questions. Had Sadow led them forward, or led them away? Had he stirred the dark side, or bent it to his will? One lord asked, "What if Sadow wins the war?" And Kresh, quiet as always, replied, then we will lose ourselves. There was no joy in what came next. Kresh had not built his life to be a traitor. He had followed the teachings, respected the rituals, but now the rituals were being rewritten. The teachings buried beneath illusions and fire. He believed he had no choice left. When the fleets returned from the outer systems, worn, scattered, fewer than before, Kresh acted. He struck not against the Republic, but against Sadow. It was not a grand battle, not at first. It was a cut in the dark, a ship sabotaged, a transmission intercepted, a loyalist commander removed without noise, each act designed to weaken, not destroy. Kresh still believed that if Sadow could be stopped without blood, the Empire might still stand. But Sadow knew. He had always known. He felt it in the Force, not like an attack, but like a shift in gravity. Something had turned against him, not an enemy, a brother. He did not send a fleet in response. He did not speak Kresh's name before the council. He simply waited. Because Sadow understood something Kresh didn't set. That betrayal is not a sword. It sits a mirror. And once it sits held up, you cannot look away. Kresh continued to move, believing time was on his side, that the others would follow, that tradition would triumph, that Sadow's empire was built on noise, and noise always fades. But slowly he began to notice silence. Too many eyes avoided his. Too many doors remained closed. And when the message finally came, a single symbol carved into the base of his chamber door, he understood. The war between Sith had already begun. The meeting was not arranged. It was inevitable. Sadow sent no warning. His ship landed at the edge of the Valley of the Dark Lords, not with a fleet, but with silence. No fanfare, no threat, just presence. And Kresh, standing among tombs older than their bloodlines, knew the time had come. They met beneath the sky that had watched them grow. The red sands around them held the memory of their shared past. Footsteps they had once walked together, questions they had once whispered as students, fears they had once shared when the stars felt too wide. Now all of that was ash. Neither man raised their voice. They didn't need it. Sadow looked into Kresh's eyes with something that might once have been grief, and Kresh looked back with something that might once have been trust. But those things had withered beneath too many choices, too many silences. You would see everything burned, Kresh said, voice steady. I would see it remembered, Sadow replied. This isn't set memory. It sets ruin. No, Sadow said, quiet now. It sets the only way they settle listen. Kresh didn't argue, because in that moment he understood the one thing he had never wanted to believe. Sadow had never sought control, not of the council, not of the empire, not even of the war. He had sought meaning, and in that search he had torn everything apart. Their duel didn't begin with a signal. It began with silence. Two forms, two wills, both shaped by the same teachings, now standing in opposite truths. The Force didn't surge in rage. It moved like grief. They fought among the tombs, not with fury, but with purpose. Every strike a sentence, every movement a conversation long overdue. Sadow fought like a man with nothing left to prove. Kresh fought like a man trying to hold on to what had already slipped away. Could it be that neither wanted to win? Could it be they both already knew how this would end? Stone cracked beneath them. Lightning twisted across the edge of the sky, but no one came to watch. No council, no followers, no Masasi. just two echoes of what the Sith had once been, tearing at each other in the ruins of memory. And when the final blow came, it wasn't out of anger. It was out of necessity. Kresh fell. Not with a scream, with a breath, as if letting go of something he had carried too long. Sadow stood over him, not in triumph, but in mourning. He did not gloat. He did not speak. He closed his eyes and knelt beside the body, pressed a hand to his chest, and whispered something only the dead would hear. Then he rose and walked into the shadows. The death of Ludo Kresh did not end the war. It ended something quieter, something deeper. It ended the balance. For all his warnings, Kresh had never tried to destroy Sadow, only stop him. His betrayal wasn't hunger for power, it was fear. Fear that they were losing the center of what the Sith had once been. And when he fell, that center fell with him. Sadow returned to Yavin, but something in him had changed. He moved slower, spoke less. Those closest to him noticed the shift. He no longer spoke of vision, no longer spoke of echoes or memory. The fire had dimmed, not extinguished, but drawn inward, as if ashamed of what it had become. Perhaps killing Kresh had cost more than he expected. Perhaps it reminded him that even those who stood against him had once walked beside him. And maybe that was the worst part of it all, not that Kresh had betrayed him, but that Sadow had made him believe he needed to. The Sith Empire did not celebrate. No parades, no proclamations. The Council, fractured and tired, simply accepted it. The surviving lords returned to their chambers, the warriors to their posts, and slowly the silence returned. But it wasn't set peace. It was emptiness. Because Kresh had been the last one to truly question, the last voice that dared to stand between vision and consequence. And now that voice was gone. Could it be that in silencing Kresh, Sadow had silenced himself? He wandered the lower levels of the temple, among chambers carved by forgotten hands. The Masasi gave him space. Even they, loyal beyond death, sensed something hollow in the air. Some nights he didn't sleep. Some nights he sat in the old stone halls, staring into the flame of a single torch, whispering names that no longer answered. And as the war faded, the consequences did not. Worlds lost, temples burned, legacies broken. The Sith had won battles, but lost memory. Sadow had wanted to build something that would never be forgotten. But what if, in doing so, he had erased what was meant to be remembered? The pain of Kresh's absence was not just political, it was personal. It was the weight of knowing that a different path had once been possible and was now gone. Years later, those who studied the fall of the Sith Empire would point to many reasons: the war with the Republic, the loss of ships, the scattering of the Masasi. But there was always one moment that felt heavier than the rest: the death of Ludo Kresh. Because it wasn't set just a death, it was the ending of a question. The question of what might have happened if someone had listened, if someone had paused, if pride had been traded just once for patience. Sadow never spoke of Kresh again. His name vanished from council records, his likeness erased from the archives, and yet in the quietest corners of Yavin, his memory lived. Some say Sadow kept a single relic from their younger days, a stone medallion carved with both their names in the ancient Sith tongue, hidden in a drawer, touched but never worn. He never said why, but maybe he didn't just need to. Could it be that the greatest betrayal wasn't Kresh's attempt to stop the war, but Sadow's refusal to stop himself? The Sith Empire collapsed slowly. not with a scream, but with a sigh. Leaders lost faith. Borders thinned. The rituals became echoes of themselves, and the people who once bowed with pride began to turn away. Sadow faded with it, not in defeat, but in quiet. He buried himself deeper in the jungle, sealed the holocrons, silenced the temples, and when the Republic came at last, there was little left to fight. Because the real battle, the one that mattered, had already ended beneath red skies and broken stones. Between two men who once called each other brother, who stood at the same altar, who dreamed of the same future and tore it apart. The question still lingers. Did Sadow truly win? Or did Kresh, in his doubt, in his stubbornness, in his final stand, break the Sith before the Republic ever could? Maybe neither won. Maybe no one did. Maybe all that remains now is the lesson that the deepest wounds are not carved by enemies, but by those who once stood beside us. And maybe that sits the one wound the Force still remembers. The stars above Yavin were quiet, not the silence of peace, but of endings, the kind of quiet that settles over a grave when there are no more voices left to speak your name. Naga Sadow drifted through the thick air of the jungle world, not as a Sith Lord, not even as a man, but as something in between, something that had lost the war, the throne, the very purpose he once believed was unshakable. His ship, hidden deep beneath ancient vines and stone, had landed in a world that did not care for kings or fallen empires. The trees did not bow. The winds did not carry his legacy. The animals, primal and cold-eyed, simply watched him pass. He had come here to disappear. But what does that mean for a Sith? Not death, not surrender. Disappearing for him was something darker. It was the beginning of a second life, not in glory, but in obsession. In the early days of his exile, Sadow built temples, not for worship, not for the Massassi who served him, but as vaults, as cages. Each stone placed with trembling hands, each chamber carved with symbols that had not been spoken aloud in 1,000 years. Sith runes of binding, of resurrection, of illusion. The Massassi, once warriors, became his tools, his experiments. They were twisted, reshaped, not with hate, but with cold precision. He needed vessels, he needed watchers, and slowly their minds began to vanish beneath layers of command and pain. They became something else, and Sadow in his silence watched what he had made. Sometimes at night he would wander into the deep ruins alone, not to check on the rituals, but to listen. The jungle, alive and loud in the day, held its breath at night, and in that breath, Sadow imagined voices, whispers. Perhaps they were real. Perhaps the Force had not forgotten him. Or perhaps in his growing madness, he had begun to invent ghosts to keep from becoming one. He never spoke of the Republic again, not of the defeat, not of the Sith who had turned on him. Not even of Kresh. The past became fog. Painful, yes, but distant. What mattered now was preservation, not of himself, but of something else. A legacy, a truth, a power he believed the galaxy would one day need. He began sealing chambers, burying relics, locking away holocrons that pulsed with sick light. But he did not do it with fear. He did it with care, as if preparing a gift for someone he would never meet. Was it a warning, a test, or a final trap? The Massassi began to worship him, not out of devotion but fear. They built more temples, larger ones. They carved his face into stone. They carried him through blood-soaked rituals meant to pierce the veil between worlds. but even they did not understand what he had become. Not a god, not a man, something else. And Sadow, in the quiet, began to forget who he had been, not because the memory was lost, but because it no longer mattered. What happens when power has no throne, when the war is over and the world does not miss you? Maybe that is when the real darkness begins. The jungles of Yavin were not silent. They breathed, they creaked and hissed, not with malice, but with memory. Every root, every vine carried the sound of something older than the Sith themselves, and in the middle of it all sat Naga Sadow, no longer a warlord, no longer a figure of fear, just a man surrounded by ghosts, some of them his own. He had built temples here, not as places of worship, but as prisons for knowledge, archives of power only he could read. The Masasi, once warriors of blood and fire, had become his servants, not through command, but through conditioning. Their minds twisted by alchemy, their loyalty etched into their bones. Yet even among them, Sadow was alone. Every night, he would stand beneath the canopy and stare at the sky, where no stars moved, no ships approached, nothing came. And in that stillness, he began to feel time in a way he never had before, not as a threat, but as a weight, heavy, relentless. There was no throne to return to, no council to command. The Sith had scattered, the Republic had healed, and he had survived when perhaps he shouldn't have. What does a Sith do when conquest is no longer possible? That question haunted him more than any Jedi ever had. So he turned to the only thing he had left. His mind, his experiments grew stranger, more cruel, not because of anger, but because of desperation. He wasn't trying to build an army anymore. He was trying to create a reason to exist. Creatures with no names, devices that whispered in languages not even the Force understood. Some of them died in silence. Some of them screamed for years. There were days when Sadow would walk among them, observing their pain, but not as a tyrant, more like a sculptor judging unfinished art. He had once believed the dark side was a tool, a way to bend life to his will. But here in exile, the dark began to bend him, not with hatred, but with boredom, with emptiness, with the echo of a legacy that no longer mattered. And yet, something inside him refused to die. A flicker, a whisper. Not hope, but hunger. Not for glory, but for understanding. He began to see the Force not as light and dark, but as sound and silence. He wondered, what if the Jedi had always misunderstood it? What if the Sith were never meant to win? What if power was not a destination but a distraction from the truth? He started carving symbols into stone that even he didn't recognize. Some came in dreams, some came from voices that only spoke during the storms. The Masasi began to worship him not as a leader, but as something more, something between God and ghost. And perhaps that's what he had become. Not alive, not dead, just waiting. But for what? Was it for revenge? Or redemption? Or maybe deep down he wasn't waiting at all. Maybe he was hiding, not from the Republic, not from the Jedi, but from the version of himself that once thought war could shape the galaxy. Maybe he knew that version had failed. The temple chambers ran deep, deeper than they were ever meant to. Sadow had carved them with his mind, not with tools. The walls were layered with spells and scars, binding energies even the Sith feared. Some rooms could not be entered twice. Some whispered names of people long dead. Others held silence so perfect it hurt. And yet he kept digging. Every level below the surface pulled him farther from who he had been. The Lord of the Sith was gone. In his place was something slower, quieter, darker, not angry, just tired. But not of life, of purpose. He had once chased meaning through war. Now he searched for it in stillness, in shadows, in the way his own breath echoed through stone. His body began to change, not from age, but from use. Alchemy leaves marks, not only on what it touches, but on the one who commands it. His skin grew pale. His eyes flickered with strange colors. He no longer needed food. He no longer slept. And still the Force stayed with him, but not as a servant. It had become something closer to a mirror, and what it showed him, he didn't always understand. He tried once to create an heir, not a student, not a warrior, but a being who might carry the quiet he had learned. It failed, over and over. They always craved power, not patience. They always reached upward, never inward. He stopped trying after the 7th, or maybe the 8th. The Masasi never questioned him. They simply carried the remains away and waited for the next attempt. In his loneliness, he began speaking aloud, not to himself, but to the walls, to the Force, to whatever might still be listening. Sometimes he spoke of the past, of Zeost, of the war, of Ludo Kresh. Sometimes he asked questions, not because he wanted answers, but because he had nothing else left to say. Could it be that the galaxy was never meant to be ruled? Was power ever anything more than a disguise for fear? Did he start the war because he believed in it, or because he needed to be seen? These questions didn't haunt him. They didn't even sadden him. They just sat with him, like companions, like the vines that crept into the lower halls, like the wind that no longer carried the scent of battle. There were no records kept of this time, no holocrons, no stories passed down, just silence. And yet somehow the legend grew, not in the Republic, but in places far beyond it, whispers of a Sith who had become something else. Something neither alive nor dead, neither sane nor mad, just waiting. And in that waiting, he left marks, not grand monuments, but small changes, shifts in the energy of the place. Stones that hummed when touched, pools of water that reflected memories instead of faces. Even the animals changed. Some grew eyes where they shouldn't, some stopped aging. The jungle adapted, as if it too was learning to survive with no purpose. And Sadow, he watched it all, sometimes from above, sometimes from beneath the roots. He no longer tried to shape the world, he simply observed it, let it breathe, let it forget him. And perhaps that was the truest kind of power he had ever touched. Not the kind that conquers, but the kind that lets go. As years passed, the jungle began to grow over his temples. Vines crawled up carved walls, trees split stone. Rain pooled in places once sealed by force fields. Nature didn't erase his legacy, it covered it, hid it, protected it. As if the world itself knew some truths were better left buried. Sadow didn't resist, he didn't repair, he let it happen. There was no war now, no rivals, no voices challenging his thoughts. In that silence, his mind stretched in new directions, not towards ambition, but towards something stranger. Memory, regret, wonder. He began to imagine what might have happened if he had stayed quiet, if he had never pushed for war, if he had listened to Kresh, not agreed, but listened. Maybe he still would have fallen. Maybe the Sith were always meant to destroy themselves. But maybe the fall could have been slower. Maybe they could have learned something before they vanished. Maybe he wouldn't be alone. It was in these reflections that something else began to grow in Sadow. Not guilt, not sorrow, but curiosity. Not about power, about meaning. What did it all amount to now? All the spells, the armies, the speeches, the fear, what had it added up to? A name in a ruined hall? A myth among beasts? And if it was only myth, was that still worth something? He started marking the stone with symbols, not for others, for himself. Lines of thought, shapes of feeling. He didn't write them in Sith language. He didn't write them in words, just shapes, circles, spirals, waves. He said it helped him think, but really it helped him forget. He stopped counting days, stopped noting seasons. Time lost its shape. He began measuring life by dreams, dreams that sometimes weren't his. Visions drifted through the force, of futures he would never see, of stars exploding, of masked men breathing through machines, of a boy looking at twin suns, not knowing he carried a shadow older than history. He didn't know their names, didn't want to know. They weren't warnings, they weren't hopes, they were echoes, and he welcomed them. They reminded him that his story was not the end of the Sith, only a page. Could it be that no Sith ever dies fully? That each leaves behind a piece too heavy to lift, but too dangerous to ignore? That every dark choice leaves behind not a legacy, but a riddle? He laughed once at that thought. The sound startled a nest of birds above him. He hadn't laughed in decades, not since Zerst. But in that moment, there was no malice, just a flicker of something close to peace. Not redemption, not clarity, just a pause. And then, as always, silence returned. He sat beneath a crumbling arch, knees folded, head tilted toward the canopy, letting the filtered light dance across his face. The Masasi waited nearby, still and faithful, but no longer feared. They didn't serve him like a god anymore. They watched him like a memory. And Sadow, the conqueror, the alchemist, the liar, closed his eyes, not in sleep, but in stillness. Time became thin. Even the force around him began to change, less like a storm, more like a whisper. There were no longer moments of clarity, no visions of future or past, just presence, just now. His powers did not fade, but they felt unnecessary. He could still bend stone, command beasts, cloud minds, but for what purpose? There was no one left to impress, no throne to claim, no war to win. The Masasi continued to build, though he never ordered it, perhaps out of memory, or devotion, or fear of stopping. They carved statues of him, but not as he looked now, thin, silent, inward. They carved the man they remembered, tall, proud, eyes full of fire, a leader who promised eternity. Sadow sometimes stared at the statues, as if trying to remember who that person was. That version of himself felt like someone he had studied in a book long ago. But sometimes he whispered to the stone quiet words, questions without answers. Were we ever right? Did I save the Sith or bury them? And sometimes he would walk deep into the temples and listen, not for voices, for the silence. Because in silence, truth doesn't lie. It just waits. He built a crypt, not a tomb. He did not plan to die in it. He simply wanted a place for the past to rest. Artifacts were stored, holocrons sealed. Not all were Sith. Some were Jedi, lost things, forbidden things, knowledge, not trophies. Maybe he hoped someone would find it. Not soon, but one day, someone who wouldn't make the same choices. Or maybe someone who would but understand them. Could it be that even the darkest hearts still want to be understood? That even monsters want their pain to mean something? The jungle grew thicker. The stars above changed slowly, and Sadow began to feel small, not in power, but in scale. He was one Sith among thousands in history, one shadow among a sky of them. Yet still he was the last of his time, the last voice of a lost era, the end of a question that had begun long before him. He never called himself Sith in the end. He didn't speak of victory or failure. He didn't mourn what was lost. He only breathed, sat, remembered. And maybe that was enough. One day he stopped speaking altogether. The Massassi noticed but didn't panic. He had always been silent for long stretches, but this time the silence didn't break. He sat at the heart of the temple, eyes open, unmoving, like a statue carved not by hands, but by time itself. No death was seen, no body was buried, just stillness. Some say he entered stasis. Others believe he became one with the dark side, not consumed, not destroyed, but dissolved. A spirit, not of fear or hate, but of memory. And the jungle swallowed his temple. Yavin became quiet once more, until someday others would come. And the darkness would breathe again. But for now, the story ends with a whisper. Not of triumph, not of regret, just a whisper of a man who once tried to conquer the stars and instead became a shadow in the trees. The jungle didn't change overnight. It crept slowly, silently. The vines that once dangled like threads now coiled tighter, wrapping the old stones of the temples in thicker arms. The skies dimmed, not because of clouds, but because the light itself seemed to bend away. And in the center of it all, Naga Sadow stood still, as if time feared to move without his permission. But time moved anyway. The Massassi had once kept their distance, now they circled closer. Their bodies, already marked by Sadow's alchemy, began to shift in new ways, not just in form but in posture. Their steps no longer followed the jungle's rhythm. They moved as if waiting for something or guarding something, or both. Sadow watched them without blinking. He had turned them into weapons, yes, but something had shifted. The way they watched him now was different. No longer with awe, no longer with fear, but with something older, something heavier. Was it belief or possession? They gathered around him during his rituals, not to learn, but to witness, as if the act of seeing him channel the Force was, to them, a sacred event. They did not speak unless spoken to, and when they did, it was always in fragments, chants, verses, echoes of the Sith language, now bent into something new, something not even Sadow could translate. And still he allowed it. He told himself it was control, that their worship gave him power, that their loyalty was fuel. But deep down in the spaces between thought, another voice whispered, what if the ritual no longer served him? What if it served them? The temples grew taller, not through technology, but labor, carved stone, burned hands. Day and night, the Massassi worked without question. They built chambers that spiraled into the earth, hallways with no exits, doorways with no doors. Everything pointed inward, toward Sadow. And yet, even he began to feel like a guest in structures meant to honor him. He walked those halls slowly, as if stepping through a dream that had gotten too real. The murals on the walls showed him, always him, but not as he was. They drew him with many arms, or no eyes, sometimes with fire where his heart should be. In every image, he stood alone, surrounded by bowed heads, and not a single one looking up. The Force in that place felt thick, not wild, but shaped. As if something was guiding it through narrow channels, holding it in place. Sadow could no longer draw it as freely. It came to him slower, with resistance, with a cost. He began to wonder, had the jungle bent to his will, or had he bent to the jungle's? He called the Masasi to him once, hoping to speak to them directly, to remind them of who he was. But when they arrived, they did not kneel. They stood still, eyes glazed, hands empty, and waited for him to speak. And when he did, they did not answer. They only turned, slowly, and walked away. No rebellion, no disrespect, just dismissal. He tried to meditate after that, but the silence was different. It pressed against him, not with peace, but with weight. The kind of silence that doesn't come from stillness, but from watching, the kind that breathes behind your back. Had he created worship or surveillance? In his sleep, he dreamed of stone faces, his own, twisted and multiplied, staring down at him with eyes that glowed red and lips that never moved. And when he woke, the jungle was still. But the statues were real. New ones, larger ones, placed outside his chamber. They hadn't been there the day before. No Masasi admitted to building them. No tools were found. And yet there they were, carved with frightening detail, eyes fixed on the entrance to his chamber, as if they were waiting for him to step out. He didn't sit, not for days. He stayed inside, listening. The temple spoke now, not with voices, but with echoes that didn't match the space. Whispers that returned before the words were finished. Sometimes laughter. And in those moments, for the first time, Naga Sadow felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not fear of death, but fear of being forgotten by the very things he had made. The transformation wasn't sudden. It never is when something ancient changes its shape. It starts with a silence that lingers too long, a glance that lasts a second too much. A breath held when it should have been released. That's how Sadow began to notice the shift, not in what the Masasi did, but in what they stopped doing. They no longer brought him offerings, not of fruit or stone or blood. They no longer chanted his name in his presence. Instead, they did it in the other chambers, the ones he didn't enter, the ones they hadn't shown him. He could feel the rhythm of their voices echoing through the stone walls like drums beneath his skin. He tried to follow them once, through a corridor that bent in ways it hadn't before. The architecture changed when he wasn't looking. New symbols appeared along the walls, not Sith, not Masasi, not anything he recognized. Lines intersecting like constellations from a sky that didn't belong to this world, and still he walked. But the halls kept folding. He never reached the source of the voices, only found himself back at his own chamber. Not because he had turned around, but because the path itself had turned him. The next day, the Masasi bowed again, as if nothing had happened. As if they hadn't led him into a loop, as if he hadn't tried to reach something he was no longer meant to find. That Sep's when he began to test them. He ordered them to tear down a shrine they'd built near the southern ridge, one that bore his face, but with 4 eyes and a serpent's jaw. They obeyed, quietly, methodically. But when he visited the site later, the rubble had been rearranged, not discarded, reformed, into a shape he didn't recognize. A cage with no door. He didn't ask questions, not aloud, but the force inside him asked on its own. Why this shape? Why now? He watched them train in the courtyards. They fought without weapons, without emotion. Their movements were sharp, timed, practiced, not wild like before, not reactive. They were no longer learning, they were remembering, as if something older had taken root inside them. Could it be that his experiments had awakened more than strength? He had twisted their bodies. Yes, he had reshaped their flesh, but he had also touched their minds, even if he hadn't meant to. The Force doesn't stop at the skin. It seeps, it roots, and sometimes it grows in ways no one expects. One night, while meditating beneath the oldest temple, he saw them gathered near a fire. Dozens of Massassi standing in a circle, no words, just breathing. A low hum rising from their chests, in perfect unison. The flames didn't flicker with the wind. They bent inward, toward the center of the ring. And in that center, nothing, just darkness. But he could feel something inside it, watching back. He turned away before it saw him. Or maybe before it recognized him. Sadow knew then, this was no longer about devotion. The Massassi weren't his worshippers anymore. They were something else, something in between. They still followed his commands, but not from loyalty, from structure, from habit, like gears in a machine that kept turning long after the builder had walked away. Was that all he was now? A symbol that started the wheel. He didn't sleep after that. Couldn't. The jungle outside was louder now. Not with beasts or storms, but with a rhythm, a slow thump like a heartbeat buried beneath the roots. And the Massassi moved with it, their steps aligned with it, their chants paced with it. He once believed he had brought order to chaos. Now he saw it differently. He had built a drum, and now it was beating on its own. And he was no longer sure if he was leading it or being marched towards something he couldn't see. Sadow kept building. Not monuments, not weapons, but patterns. He etched them into stone, into bone, into the walls of the inner sanctum where the Force trembled like a held breath. He wasn't just guiding energy anymore. He was trapping it, folding it, trying to understand what the Massassi had become and what they were still becoming. He drew maps of their blood, not literal veins, but the pathways he sensed when they moved through the temples. Their essence no longer flowed like his. It twisted, spiraled, looped back on itself. There were corners of their minds that bent space the way hyperspace did, and it scared him. Because it felt like the kind of change that couldn't be undone. He tried to speak with them. Not as master, but as one lost soul to another. He asked what they saw when they closed their eyes. What visions stirred when they chanted into the earth. They did not answer. Not because they refused, but because they didn't understand the question. They no longer dreamed in words. They dreamed in shapes. One of them, the tallest, with deep crimson scars running down both arms, placed a hand on Sadow's chest during one of these moments, not in violence, in recognition, as if trying to remind him of something. His hand was warm, the Force pulsed through it like a slow wave, and for just a second, Sadow saw something. Not memory, not future, just a space. A black field. No stars, no end, and he was standing in the middle of it, alone. He pulled away before it swallowed him. After that, he stopped speaking to them. He started speaking to the walls instead, whispering into stone, into moss, into dust. He carved warnings no one would ever read, spoke truths he wasn't sure were his. Every word was a thread, tying him to something more ancient than the Sith, more patient than the Force. Could it be that the jungle itself had always been listening? The Massassi no longer aged, at least not the way he remembered beings aging. Their muscles thickened, their movements slowed, but never weakened. Their eyes grew darker, but sharper, and some of them stopped blinking altogether. He caught one watching him for hours once, perched high in the vines above a half-finished spire. eyes wide, mouth closed, no movement, just stillness, like stone waiting to remember it was once alive. When Sadow looked up and met his gaze, the Masasi did not flinch, he simply held his breath. And in that breath, the wind around the temple stopped. And when he exhaled, the trees swayed again. That was the night Sadow began locking his chambers. Not because he feared death, he had made peace with that long ago, but because he feared becoming part of something else. Something he couldn't name. Something they were already building, not with their hands, but with their presence. The rituals grew more complex. They no longer used fire, they used silence. Long silences, gatherings where no one moved, no one spoke, and yet the temperature would rise, or drop, or the vines would pull tighter against the stone walls. Sadow felt it in his teeth, in the base of his skull, a rhythm without sound. He started marking time by the quiet. He no longer knew how many days had passed, whether the sun rose the same way each morning, whether the moon still moved. The jungle canopy was too thick to tell, and maybe it had always been, or maybe it was thicker now. But he knew this, the Masasi no longer needed him to lead. They were no longer following, they were circling, not as predators, but as anchors, as if he was the one thing they had chosen not to let go of. And he began to wonder, was their devotion keeping him alive, or was it keeping him here? He began testing the edges, walking farther into the jungle, leaving at odd hours, remaining silent, disappearing for days, not to flee, but to see. Would they follow? Would they search? Would they stop him? The first time, nothing happened. The second, he returned to find 3 Masasi kneeling at the threshold of his temple, heads bowed, hands open, as if waiting to receive something or return something he had left behind. They did not speak. They did not move. They just waited. And when he stepped past them, they rose without sound and disappeared back into the trees. Not guards, not disciples. Watchers. He didn't still sleep that night. He dreamed of vines coiling around his limbs, not in violence but with purpose, like roots claiming soil, like the jungle had decided he belonged to it. What if they never meant to worship him? What if this entire time the Masasi had been obeying something older? Not the Sith, not the Force, but the planet itself. Yavin wasn't dead. It wasn't even dormant. It was listening, watching, measuring, and the Masasi were its mouth. He tried to test it, sent one of them away, back to a part of the ruins untouched by rituals, told him to remain there for 3 days, alone, with no chant, no task, no presence of Sadow himself. The Masasi obeyed, and returned with an offering, a stone flat and black, etched with spirals that Sadow hadn't taught him, symbols he couldn't read. The stone hummed in his hand. It was warm, wet, as if freshly pulled from something alive. He threw it into the fire. The fire went out. He told himself it was coincidence, but the nights grew colder after that. He stopped testing them, and he started recording his thoughts, not as warnings, not as teachings, but as a way to hear his own voice. Something separate, something that reminded him he still had edges, that he wasn't already swallowed. He spoke into crystals, carved into the deeper layers of the temple walls. He used a language even the Masasi didn't understand, or so he hoped. He began to speak of loneliness. Not the kind that comes from being forgotten, but the kind that comes from realizing you are not the author of your own story anymore, that the script you thought you wrote was handed to you long ago, that your choices weren't side doors but mirrors, and every time you stepped through one, it only brought you back to the same place, the same breathless dark. Was this what the dark side truly was? Not power, not rage, but isolation. He remembered the war, the blood, the betrayals, the way his name once made stars tremble. It all felt absurd now, like a play he had watched, not lived. The jungle didn't set care. The Masasi didn't care. And somewhere beneath the earth, beneath the stone, beneath the words he whispered into nothing, something else listened. He began to hear it in the silence. A hum. Low, constant, not threatening but present, as if the planet itself had a pulse and it had finally synced with his. He stopped resisting. He stopped asking. And in that surrender, he began to see. Not visions, not truth, but clarity. He saw the temples not as structures, but as lungs, breathing in energy, breathing out silence. He saw the Masasi not as followers, but as nerves. He saw himself not as master, not even as prisoner, but as organ, part of something vast, and still growing. Time lost shape. There were days when the sky never changed color, when he couldn't tell whether it was morning or dusk. The vines grew thicker, closer to the temple walls. The air, once heavy with mist, now felt warm and pulsing like breath against skin. Even his own reflection began to change, less sharp, less certain. His features blurred in the pools where he once saw himself clearly. Was it the dark side, or was it the jungle reshaping him? The Masasi never left. They no longer needed instruction. They moved in patterns he didn't teach, performed rituals he never described. Every morning they painted the temple floor with ash in symbols that had no name. Every night they chanted, sometimes in the Sith tongue, sometimes in a sound deeper than language. A sound that felt like it was coming from beneath the planet's crust. A sound he now heard in his sleep. He watched them from the shadows, watched as they knelt, then rose, not like people but like tides. He wondered if they still had memories, or if those had been replaced, rewritten, or erased. One night, one of them approached him, not to ask, not to serve, just to stand beside him. They stood in silence, and Sadow felt something strange, not fear, not power, something in between. Recognition. As if this Masasi, whose name he never knew, now shared something with him no apprentice ever had. Not obedience, not wisdom, but sameness. Two creatures shaped by something greater than themselves. Two beings rewritten by the same hand. He didn't instead speak, but he nodded, and the Masasi nodded back. Was this devotion, or was this understanding? He returned to his chambers and found a mirror had cracked, not from heat, not from impact. It had split down the center, clean and silent. He left it broken. He stopped writing in stone. The stories had already left him. He no longer needed to record them. They now lived in the chants, in the fireless torches, in the eyes of those who circled the temple every morning and bled just enough into the soil to stain it, not in pain, but in offering. They didn't worship him anymore. They became him. His fears, his hunger, his silence reflected in them so completely that he no longer knew where he ended and they began. He was still Naga Sadow, wasn't Sith he? Or was that name now just the echo that led them here? A symbol carved into stone, a story whispered by firelight, a god not because he ruled, but because he stayed. And in that staying he surrendered, but not to them, to Yavin, to whatever ancient force slept beneath its roots, beneath its breath, beneath its silence. He had fled war, betrayal, the collapse of empires, and found something older than any of them. Not death, not peace, but stillness. A kind of power no war could offer. Not control, but permanence. And so he sat, and the Masasi circled, and the jungle grew. And though he spoke less and less, his presence deepened. He had become myth, but myths do not sleep. They wait. The jungle had quieted since Sadow's last breath, but the silence was not peace. It was weight. It hung in the air above Yavin like mist, like memory. The temples stood still, half swallowed by vines, their edges softened by time. But the force did not forget. It moved like a low hum beneath the soil, humming through stone, echoing through roots, whispering truths to no one, or perhaps to someone not yet listening. Exar Kun came centuries later, young and bright and burning with questions. He was not born into darkness, but he followed it, and something on Yavin called to him, not in language, not in symbols, but in feeling, like a distant voice, too soft to understand but too steady to ignore. They say the Force speaks to those who open themselves to it, but what if it also lingers for those who left too much behind? When Kun first stepped through the overgrown ruins, he saw nothing but relics, cracked stone, faded carvings, a jungle trying to erase a god. But the deeper he walked, the less he trusted his own senses. The air didn't feel natural. The heat pressed harder. The shadows bent where they shouldn't, and in the back of his mind, there was a whisper. Not a voice, exactly. Not Sadow's name, just an idea. A presence, cold, patient, waiting. He found the altars first, blackened and scorched from long-dead rituals. The Masasi had vanished, but their markings remained. Scars on the earth, prayers etched into bones, statues with faces chiseled off, as if even memory had tried to erase its source. Yet, beneath the dust, Kun felt something breathing, something unfinished. Could it be that Sadow never truly left? Horn wasn't afraid. That was his flaw. He believed knowledge was power, and power could be mastered. But Yavin didn't want to be mastered. It wanted to be remembered. Sadow's work, the alchemy, the worship, the hunger, it hadn't been destroyed. It had been buried. And Khorne, in his pride, began to dig. The first time he entered the central temple, he didn't feel like a conqueror. He felt like an intruder. The walls pulsed faintly with crimson veins of energy, long dormant but not dead. And somewhere in the distance, the force cracked, not loudly, but like a wound reopening. Was that when the chain began? Not a bond of training or blood, but something stranger, a thread across time. One Sith who refused to fade, reaching toward another who didn't yet understand what he was becoming. Kun would later believe he chose the dark side, but what if it had already chosen him? The answers weren't in scrolls or holocrons, they were in the stone itself. The very shape of the temples, spirals, and spires carved in unnatural precision began to shift in his dreams. He saw figures he never met, heard chants he never studied, felt rage he never earned. And yet, it felt like home. The dreams came more often after that, not nightmares. There was no fear in them, just presence, just sound. He'd close his eyes and feel stone pressing against his spine. He'd hear footsteps in corridors he hadn't yet explored. Voices layered on top of each other, whispering in languages lost before he was born. They didn't tell him what to do. They didn't offer warnings. They just watched. One night, he saw a figure, tall, robed, motionless, eyes burning from beneath a hood. It did not speak. It only raised its hand, and Exar Kun, in his dream, bowed. When he woke, he told himself it meant nothing, just residue, just imagination. But the next day, when he stood in the same corridor from the dream, the air was colder, the shadows thicker, and the silence familiar. Could it be that the Force remembers its own scars? Kun continued his studies, but he no longer wrote them down. The knowledge was inside him now, not learned but absorbed. He spoke Sith words he had never been taught. He moved through rituals without planning them. Something inside him had taken root, and he didn't question it. He welcomed it. It felt like power. But what if it was memory? Sadow's rituals had been brutal, twisting bodies, bending minds, feeding the dark side, not with hate alone, but with surrender. The Massassi had been his clay, but clay does not forget the shape of the sculptor's hands. And when Kun walked through the temple halls, the walls responded, not because they knew him, but because they remembered someone else. That was the difference. Kun thought he was carving his own path. But step by step, he was retracing another's. His hands touched the same altars. His blood soaked into the same stone. And somewhere in the dark beneath the temple, the Force moved not forward but backward, repeating a cycle not yet broken. He began to feel watched, not by Jedi, not by enemies, by something older, something patient, a presence that didn't want him to fall, but wanted him to kneel, not to serve, but to repeat. As if the past wasn't finished, as if Sadow's ambition still hung unfinished in the air, needing someone else to carry it. And Kun, with his pride and brilliance, fit the mold perfectly. The Massassi returned, not born but awakened, hidden remnants, buried in the jungle, drawn out by Kun's presence. They did not speak. They did not resist. They knelt, and just like Sadow before him, Kun mistook obedience for loyalty. But their eyes held the same emptiness, the same watching silence, as if they remembered something he did not. He thought they followed his power. But what if they only followed the pattern? They built for him, the same stones, the same shapes. They carved his face, painted his name, not because they knew him, but because they had always been waiting. The jungle hadn't forgotten. The temples hadn't forgotten. And now neither had they. And still the whispers came. He could hear Sadow's name in them, sometimes not clearly, never loudly, but buried in the rhythm of breath, in the creak of stone, as if the Force itself had not let go, as if legacy was a haunting. Could it be that Sadow, in his desperation, had planted a seed that took centuries to bloom? Exar Kun thought he was chosen, but maybe he was summoned, not by prophecy, not by destiny, but by unfinished will. The lines between past and present were no longer clear. Exar Kun would close his eyes to meditate and open them in places he had never stood. The air would change, the jungle would fade, and he would find himself beneath stars that hadn't shone for thousands of years. Sometimes he saw cities, other times a throne, but always the same eyes watching him, the same silence pressing against his skin. It wasn't memory, it wasn't vision, it was inheritance, but not the kind you choose. Kun began to mimic what he didn't understand. His voice echoed through chambers in chants that were older than his bloodline. He didn't know where the words came from, only that they felt correct, as if his tongue had always known them, as if the Force had simply been waiting for him to speak. And when he did, something in the temple shifted. Stone slid open where there were no seams, light glowed from crystals buried in darkness, and the Massassi gathered, not in fear, not in wonder, but in rhythm, as if they'd done it before, as if they'd heard these words from another mouth long ago. Was he their master, or just the latest echo? Kong told himself it was power, that the temple responded to his will, but the truth hung heavy in the silence. These walls did not answer to him. They remembered him, or at least remembered someone who felt like him, a shape that had been carved into time, now worn into place again. He tried to rewrite the rituals to bend them into new forms, but the dark side resisted. It was not chaotic, it was patterned. It flowed through grooves already etched in stone, in soul, in blood. Every time he reached for something new, it pulled him back to something old. And that frightened him. He had come to Yavin to surpass the Sith who came before him. But the more he reached for that future, the more he was dragged into someone else's past. A past that did not belong to him. A past that refused to die. In one chamber, deeper than the rest, he found a sigil burned into the floor. Not carved, burned. The air smelled like ash, though nothing had burned in ages. He stepped around it, but the Massassi would not. They knelt beside it, heads bowed, hands pressed to their chests, as if that symbol was not just sacred, but still alive. Kun stood there for hours, watching them. They did not move. They did not blink. And when he finally left, he felt lighter, but not in relief. Something had stayed behind. The dreams returned, but now he wasn't watching. He was being watched. Eyes behind mirrors, faces without names, and always, always, that feeling of unfinished things, of something waiting for him to complete what Sadow had started. But what if that was the trap? What if Sadow had never died in peace? What if the Force had locked his voice into the stone, waiting for someone foolish enough to listen? And what if Exar Kun wasn't chosen at all? What if he was bait? Gust began speaking less, not from humility, but caution. The more he heard the temple speak back, the more he wondered if his voice had ever truly been his. The Massassi followed him, still. But now they looked through him, as if waiting for something behind his eyes to finally arrive. He studied the murals on the walls, figures with arms raised, stars bleeding from their fingers, beasts bent in worship. At first he thought they were depictions of victory, but over time they began to feel like warnings. The eyes of the painted figures were always wide, not with glory, with fear. And in that fear, he saw himself. The Force trembled differently now. Its weight was familiar, but colder. Before it had answered him like a loyal current. Now it lingered before responding, as if it were remembering another voice, testing him against it, judging the shape of his soul. He told himself he was stronger, smarter, more focused than the one who came before. But deep down, a quiet thought pulsed like a heartbeat. Was that what Sadow believed too? The Massassi changed again. Sorry. Their chants grew longer. Their eyes stayed closed during rituals, even after the words had ended. They spoke in unison, but never in his language, and the stone beneath the temple warmed slightly whenever they did. He asked no questions. He gave no commands. He only watched. At night, the whispers returned, not in dreams, but in echoes through the halls. Sometimes words, sometimes laughter. Never loud, never near, just close enough to make him wonder if he had lost track of time or sanity. The jungle outside no longer felt like wilderness. It felt like a wall, each tree a god, each vine a gate. He could leave, of course. He told himself that many times. His ship was buried, but his will was not. Yet every morning he stayed, not because he chose to, but because nothing beyond those trees seemed real anymore. One day, deep in the catacombs, Kun found something that hadn't been written about in any scroll. A door, circular, sealed, no seams, no handles, just a surface of black stone, smooth as water, cold to the touch. When he reached out with the force, it didn't resist, it didn't open, it simply hummed, like it knew him, like it had been waiting. He didn't try to open it again, not yet. He told himself he would study it, learn its secrets first, but the truth was simpler. He wasn't set sure what would answer. And behind that hesitation, a darker truth. What if the door wasn't locked? What if he was? The seasons passed without ceremony. No days were marked, no sunrises counted, only the slow shift of wind through stone corridors and the endless gaze of the Masasi. Kun had become more than a leader to them. He was a figure now, half man, half shadow, framed in the firelight of their temples. But he did not feel worshipped, he felt watched. He once believed knowledge would set him free, that by understanding Sadow's secrets, he could rewrite his own fate. But knowledge had not freed Sadow, and now Kun felt the same chains, only quieter, heavier, made not of metal but of belief. He stood alone in the chamber of inscriptions, where the walls pulsed faintly with red light, reacting to the force as if breathing. Each symbol glowed with the same rhythm as his own heartbeat. But when he tried to stop just for a moment, the lights continued pulsing without him. That's when he knew. He was no longer teaching the dark side. He was being taught. It was not Sadow's voice that filled the chamber. It was something older. Maybe something that had once listened to Sadow too. Maybe something that had whispered to every Sith who reached too far into the dark. Kun had always thought of the Force as something to bend, something to shape. But now he wondered, was the Force shaping him? Not like a sculptor molds clay, but like a canyon wears away stone, little by little, until nothing original remains. One night, as thunder rolled beyond the treetops, he returned to the sealed door. It was no longer cold, no longer silent. It pulsed now softly, in rhythm with his thoughts. He raised his hand, not to open it, but to acknowledge it. And in that moment, the Masasi appeared behind him. Dozens, silent, still, no weapons, no words, just waiting. He turned slowly. No command was given, none needed. One by one, they knelt, and then they began to chant, not to Kun, not even in his name, but in a language older than Sith. It sounded like wind, stone, fire, and bone, all speaking at once. He didn't understand it, but the door did. It opened. Inside was no throne, no treasure, only a single beam of black light stretching from floor to ceiling. It made no sound, cast no shadow, but Kun felt its pull like gravity. He stepped inside. Pain didn't come, nor power, just silence. All his ambition, all his questions, all his rebellion and need for meaning, they floated there still inside him, but muted. He felt hollow, not broken, not whole, just paused. Then he heard it, a whisper, not Sadow, not the Force, something between. It didn't speak in words, It didn't offer commands. It simply was a presence that wrapped around him like memory. And in that quiet, a question bloomed in his mind. Had he come this far to become something new, or to finish something old? He stepped back out. The door closed behind him without sound. The Masaci rose. Their eyes met his, but they didn't see a man anymore. They saw the next chapter. There is a silence deeper than death. Not the kind that falls after war, nor the kind that fills empty halls. This silence lives in memory, the kind that's buried, not forgotten, because forgetting would be mercy. That is where Naga Sadow rests now. Not in the jungle, not in a tomb of stone, but in a silence chosen by those who came after him. The Sith speak often of power. They tell tales of victory, of betrayal, of the cold path to strength. But they do not speak of Sadow. His name, once written in fire across the stars, now lingers only in whispers between cracked stones. His face does not sit beside the statues in the Valley of the Dark Lords. His story is not taught to acolytes in the temples, and when his name is found, it is spoken like a warning or a curse. Why? Was he too ambitious, too wild, too much of a dreamer, even for the Sith? His tomb remains on Korriban, sealed in stone, watched by none. The others, Marka Ragnos, Ajunta Pal, Tulak Horde, are still visited, still feared. But Sadow's resting place is quiet. It does not hum with power. It does not tempt with secrets. It waits. Some say he buried himself, that after Yavin, after the Masaci, he entombed his own legacy in the sand. Others say the Sith erased him piece by piece, because what he had become was too much like a mirror. He showed them not what they were, but what they might become. He was a warning, not because he failed, but because he succeeded in becoming something the Sith feared. Not a tyrant, not a destroyer, but something stranger. He made worshippers. He turned fear into faith, command into doctrine, and in doing so he broke the rules that even the Sith kept close. He stopped ruling with power and started being followed with belief. Could that have been the final heresy? The Sith accept hate. They wield it like fire. But belief, true, sacred belief, is dangerous. It cannot be controlled. It turns leaders into idols, and idols burn too bright. So they buried him. Not just his body, but his story. They unmade his myth. They turned his tools into artifacts, his writings into riddles. They made him a ghost, a mistake, something better left untouched. And yet, even in silence, he remains. There is a silence heavier than death, not the kind left by war or time, but the kind that is chosen. Naga Sadow's name once echoed through empires. Now it's avoided, not lost. Buried, Sith holocrons skip over him. Temples bear no mention. His tomb, sealed on Korriban, stands untouched, watched by no one. Other lords are remembered, their power admired, their mistakes studied, but not Sadow. His absence feels intentional, like a shadow someone tried to erase but couldn't. He didn't just command, he inspired belief. He became something more than a ruler, and maybe that's why they hid him. The Sith fear many things, but perhaps most of all, they fear mirrors. And Sadow became one. Not a symbol of failure, but a reflection of what the Sith could become if power turned into worship. He was never forgotten, just never spoken of. The tomb still stands, cold deep beneath the red sands of Korriban. Its walls hum faintly, like breath held too long. Few dare enter, fewer return. Those who do speak of voices, not loud but low, layered as if the air itself remembers him. They say the walls bleed heat, that the dark side coils there, still listening, still waiting. Inside lie fragments, not bones, not relics, but impressions. A cracked holocron, a half-sunken sarcophagus, a statue with no face, not ruins of a man, but pieces of something too large to fully vanish. Some Sith once came, hoping to steal his secrets. They left afraid, not of death, but of understanding. Could it be that Sadow left his truth there not as a warning, but as a challenge? He wasn't reaching forward, he was holding a mirror. There's a reason his legacy bends instead of breaks. It survives not in books but in instincts, in the way certain Sith whisper before they strike, in the way power sometimes feels like loneliness wearing a crown. They don't quote him, but they act like him, as if his spirit taught something too sharp to name. He ruled without needing to be seen. He built followers who forgot how to question. And when he vanished, he didn't fall, he dissolved into myth, into method. Was that his final lesson? That the greatest control comes not from chains, but from silence? When Exar Kun walked Yavin's ruins, the stones still remembered, the force still stirred. And perhaps, just perhaps, that stirring was Sadow watching, weighing, wondering. Would someone finish what he started? Or would they repeat the same hunger dressed in new names? They stopped saying his name, not out of hate, but out of fear. Sadow didn't just seek control, he rewrote what control meant. He made gods out of followers, made temples out of silence, and in doing so he showed the Sith something they didn't want to see. That devotion could look like madness. That conquest could rot from the inside. And that power, once unchained, might never return to its leash. So they buried him in more than stone. They buried him in denial, as if pretending he never mattered could erase what he proved. But the Force doesn't forget. It lingers in patterns, echoes, reflections. And in those echoes, the same question keeps whispering. What if he was right? What if the Sith weren't ready for his kind of darkness? Sadow's tomb still stands, quiet, undisturbed, but not empty. Not truly. Something lingers there, not just relics, not just bones, a presence, faint but patient, as if waiting to be remembered or feared again. No records explain why his name faded. No holocron mourns him. But perhaps that silence is louder than any monument. Because if they spoke his name, they'd have to admit what he saw, that the Sith were always chasing freedom, yet building cages of their own, that they feared losing control more than they feared weakness. And he became what they dared not become. So they let his legend rot. But maybe somewhere in the Force, his shadow still watches, still listens, still waits. Not to rise again, but to remind them that the mirror they buried with him still shows their face.